just a little bit of the Internationale for us, which is the International Song of Workers, and of course it's celebrated by people who were celebrating the Russian Revolution and other regimes which it spawned. So this is reminding us that this little recap is of Marx and Engels, our first key thinkers of socialism. And so what we do in this next, however many minutes it takes, 15, 20 minutes, is to try and do a recap of what I talked about on Tuesday. You should come away with 4 key ideas for Marx and Engels, and hopefully we probably won't keep over that video, but we will be able to think about these 4 boxes which are on the second page of your handout. And by the time I finished, I'll have given you something to say for each of those 4 boxes. And in the session, we kind of thought about, we evaluated to what extent these might be true or ways in which we might criticize them. I think that's going to be something we do in the classroom when we get together eventually after next week. Okay, so let's see why this is important for us when we're thinking about these key thinkers. Lots of rubbish is talked about Marxism or cultural Marxism, or if you listen to kind of people on the right and far right in particular. And one of the things I wanted to point out in the beginning here is that they're not seen by most people in the same way that those people on the right want us to think. So I showed this picture, which I think kind of looks a bit like a picture from, I don't know, Eastern Europe sometime in the 1960s or something. In fact, it's a picture from Manchester in 2018, I think it is. It's Frederick Engels, Marx's writing partner and benefactor, being installed on a plinth in Manchester, because that's where Frederick Engels, his family firm, had been, and it's where he made his money, and therefore he also wrote about the English working class, the condition of the English working class in Manchester in the 1840s. So people in Manchester want there to be statues of Engels, and when we look at Marx too, there you are, Manchester, welcome to Manchester. When we look at Marx too, this is in Trier, which is where Marx was born. They have him on traffic lights. He is not therefore universally despised. In fact, Marx won a BBC poll of the greatest thinker of all time. He regularly comes top in kind of like, favourite philosophers. And more than a third of millennials, according to a YouGov poll, approve of communism. So they're not put off by any claims that are made by the right here. And I think what I want us to see is there isn't an equivalence. Even if people want to draw an equivalence between horrible dictators like Stalin and Hitler and similar sorts of people, that doesn't extend all the way back to the ideas which someone like Stalin or people like Chinese rulers, Mao Zedong, distorted for their own ends. So in that case, that's your disclaimer out of the way. I'll put this up as well, just to show you that, when the right are complaining about statues being defaced and history being rewritten and that kind of thing as well, then they weren't complaining much about this one, which is Marx's tomb in Highgate in London being attacked. I think it's been cleaned up now, so if you're in London, you can go and have a look at it yourself. So these 4 ideas then. This video, by the way, is one which I'd set for a little bit of homework before, and I'm not going to talk about it now because it's kind of self-explanatory, but the language is quite useful. And at the end of tomorrow's session, we'll have collected a few words about, or session number 6, it'll be the recap, a few words about revolutionary socialism, which you should learn because that is going to be useful for a game of socialism bingo that we have next week. Good, so crack on. These are the 4 big ideas we're going to try and pick apart here from Marx and Engels. Enormous range of work, enormous number of books and articles and things that both of them wrote, not just Marx. I'm going to start with this one about class and Marx's contention. You remember me saying this probably from the first sentence of the Communist Manifesto. The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of the class struggle. What we want to do is say, why is this distinctive? So for each of these ideas, we're going to try and do these things in the pink box here. In normal circumstances, I'd have given these to each of you on a group of 4 on a table, and you'd have unpacked them and then you'd have explained them to the rest of the class, but I'll do it for us, given that we're not in normal circumstances. So we're trying to think about what is new or distinctive about this set of ideas that we haven't got from political philosophy before, political ideas before. Could we find any evidence to support it? Is it true, in fact? Is it analysis that reflects reality? If it is true, what are the implications for it? And why might we criticize the idea? So we're going to try and do that with these four ideas. We won't Kahoot. We think about this one about class, because one of Marx's arguments is that when things change from time to time, if we listen to liberals, what we tend to think of is things change because things just keep getting better and better. Maybe it's because we learn from our mistakes, or maybe we're just kind of like developing our ideas better and better as well. We're becoming freer, more respectful of each other's rights, and therefore we're on a kind of escalator of history. That's not always true, of course, is it? Because sometimes we take backward steps, like with fascism or wars, or currently we can think about the rise of kind of people who are authoritarians, and the revival of racism, and all sorts of other things as well. So they clearly don't go in a straight line. So Marx's argument about why things change in history went beyond simply thinking new ideas or as developing over time, and instead he put it all down to class struggle and the conflict that takes place everywhere in every society, which is the motor of history. And to explain this, one of the things we want to think about is the way that Marx is interested in what controls the economic base of society, what we'll call the mode of production. That's Marx's language of just meaning the means of making stuff. Who's in control of that? Marx's argument is that before capitalism, we had a feudal society. There it is. And that feudal society was based on kings and lords and aristocrats owning some land. And in owning that land, they were the rulers, they were the ruling class. But underneath them, there weren't just peasants. There were other people, by the time we get to the 15th, 16th, 17th century, who were making money in other ways apart from just owning land and having peasants work on it. They're people who were first in banking and then eventually in inventing factories to make stuff as well. And this growing middle class, this growing bourgeoisie, because they came from the towns, so they were bourgeois, needs to expand its power. And in order to expand its power, it needs to be able to not be taxed. It needs to be able to take control of government policy. It needs to be able to find new markets. It needs the state to work on its behalf. But the state won't do that while it's busy protecting the interests of a feudal, old-fashioned ruling class. So what happens is the bourgeois class overtakes the old ruling class and dislodges it. And in England, we can argue, Marx argued, that what that looks like is Parliament taking control of society and getting rid of the king. And in France, it's also the people going onto the streets and then executing the king. And these are what Marx calls bourgeois revolutions. Marx is arguing that these are the things which drive society forward, because in each one, we then unleash a whole new stage of development of, in our case, capitalism. And Marx is also arguing that this class element is also the thing which in our time, in creating capitalism, the bourgeoisie have also created a working class, because they have to, because that's the way in which they're going to exploit, create value, create profits and accumulate capital. But in pulling together from the fields a load of people who used to be peasants and then cramming them into factories and cities, that class then becomes not only angry and exploited because they're being mistreated by capitalism, but capable of overthrowing and dislodging the ruling class and creating a society themselves. So Marx's idea about how society is going to develop from capitalism isn't just because we're going to think about having better ideas. It's because capitalism has created, in the class struggle, capitalism has created this class which is capable of overthrowing it. We're going to come back to this idea later on as well about why this is relevant to revolution. Okay, that's our first big idea. Second big idea is to do with what Marx calls false consciousness. Because if it's true that class is something which is created, or class conflicts has created capitalism, and that capitalism is built on exploitation, and we can see that a tiny minority of people benefit, but the rest of us don't, why don't we do something to change it? Marx's argument here is that what's going on is that all societies are characterized by an economic base. Imagine like an iceberg, in which the real bulk of how the world is is hidden beneath the surface and we can't really see it. All we get to see is the tip of the iceberg. Marx thinks about this as the superstructure. So the state, the media, other institutions which protect the system, they're the ones we can see, but they give a completely different appearance of what society is really like because we can only see the tip of them. And that superstructure is built on creating what we'll call a kind of common sense. And that common sense is not like when your parents say, oh, have some common sense, like the right way of thinking. That common sense is the way in which the world is commonly seen by people and not normally challenged. So there is a natural order between people who are up there and who are capable and wealthy and rich and born to rule, and the rest of us who know our place. That if you try really hard, you might be able to get there too, even though you almost certainly probably won't. There isn't an alternative, and this is the best of all sorts of societies we can hope for, and it's here to stay, even though all historical evidence tells us that all historical stages are replaced by another one that comes along afterwards. So this common sense is a powerful kind of propaganda in convincing society, everybody in society, that capitalism should be sustained and shouldn't be challenged. And that's because when Marx is talking about ideas, when Marx is talking about consciousness, the way we think and act, that's a human nature thing here. This superstructure is not just one which is just happened by accident. It is something which is created by a ruling class to serve the interests of the ruling class and reflect their views all the time. This is why it's the ruling class who run not only the state, but the media, the ruling class's ideas, which are percolated through things like religion and institutions, and indeed even through education as well. So we think about the way in which education actually isn't just about getting you to learn new things and challenge the world, but is about getting you to learn the skills that the employers need and do as you're told. That's one of the main things you learn about school, isn't it? Do as you're told. Okay. That means that one feature of that false consciousness is the way in which we come to actually like capitalism, because we think that it's in our interests, or at least it's distracting us from the way in which we're exploited. Marx referred to this in terms of religion. He said that religion was the heart of a heartless world, a haven in a hell, the sigh of the oppressed creature. It is the opiate of the people. It's the thing that people go to in order to escape from the reality of exploitation and brutal existence in capitalism. In that case, then, one of the things we're going to need to do if we've got any hope of getting rid of capitalism is to get rid of this false consciousness. How do we do that? And this is the clincher for Marx, is what wraps everything together, because that doesn't just happen by people like Marx writing books, because not everybody reads Capital or even the Communist Manifesto. It happens by workers being involved in struggle, which they're necessarily required to do because of the crises that capitalism experiences, which are built on its inherent contradictions. So in dragging all these workers together, these workers then come to recognize that they've got a common interest. And in crises times, they tend to struggle and fight in that common interest. They become a class in themselves, and in fighting for their rights and fighting for not to be unemployed or for better wages or whatever else capitalism throws at them, they become a class for themselves, because they come to recognize not only that they could win an extra few percent pay rise, but they can have the potential power to run society. They are the ones, after all, who, if they stop working, can bring capitalism to a halt. They are the ones, after all, who are running capitalism, really. They're the ones who are making everything work. Therefore, they're the ones who realize that they could be capable of running society. Okay, key idea number 2 then. About number 3. I'm not going to play this video. You can play it in your own time. But one of the things it's based on is something we've talked about before, that capitalism is inherently unstable, that it's not a naturally balanced system, which is great at distributing resources and is the best of all possible worlds, and therefore something we all benefit from. Capitalism is based upon the accumulation of capital through competition between different private interests, and that produces 2 things. One, it produces overproduction, because you've got lots and lots of capitalist interests trying to outdo each other to fill a hole in the market by producing lots and lots of things really quickly. That's why they enhance and increase technology in factories or whatever it happens to be as well. So they produce too much stuff. But at the same time, they're doing so and trying to do so as cheaply as possible by paying wages as little as possible. And that means that once people with a little bit of money or enough money have bought the product that they're making, nobody else can afford to buy those products. And that means then there's underconsumption. So those two things, overproduction and underconsumption, are the roots of the crises which capitalism keeps going through, where it has every 30 or 40 years, it'll have these huge depressions, huge spiraling depressions. So it's a system that doesn't work, and also a system which is capable of drawing into opposition with itself, the working class, which up to that point it's been exploiting. Okay, so big idea number 3. Big idea number 4 then is about how we're going to change this. Now, bear in mind, this is what I should have started with at the beginning. Everything we're talking about here is a characteristic of revolutionary socialism. It's what makes revolutionary socialism distinctive, and therefore it sets them apart from the other 3 types of socialism we're going to look at from next week onwards. That's democratic socialism, social democracy, and third way socialism, or what we think of as new labour type socialism. Why do they all think that it can be delivered by government by passing a series of reforms, by electing a Labour Party led by a kind of decent, charming person like Keir Starmer, who's going to hand it down to the workers? And Marx and Engels think that that's not going to work. Instead, we must have a revolution. And this comes down to Marx and Engels' understanding of history. All other systems up to now have not been brought about by incremental piecemeal reform, even if that's what liberal history teaches us. Instead, they've been brought about by crisis, often violent and bloody overthrows of one regime by another. And when we think about revolution here, we're not simply thinking about a palace coup, like a few dozen people with some rifles who kill a king and move in. What we're really talking about is a fundamental change in economic and social relations. So it's changing the mode of production. The people who are actually running society, not just the state, but the people who are running the economic interests, are dislodged in place of some other people in order to create new economic relations. That's necessary, or that's likely to happen rather, in capitalism, because just like all the other regimes, capitalism has created the very force which is going to overthrow it. Without capitalism, we wouldn't have been able to create a working class which was, one, capable of operating machinery, creating an abundance, and creating enough stuff that we could all share in it. But 2, without capitalism, we wouldn't have been able to drag together a force which has the capability, has the power, the potential power of overthrowing capitalism and running society itself. It's because these are the people who are actually digging the coal, running the factories, making the computers, and whatever else is going on in society. That's why they've got the power to run a future society as well. But why couldn't we just, that sounds like it's still going to be through force and violence and something potentially unpleasant. Why couldn't we just elect a Labour government to do these nice things for us? Well, that's because the ruling class are never going to let a Labour government like that get into power. Maybe this is one of the things we can see with Corbyn in a very small way. It's not a Marxist at all, but somebody who did kind of threaten the capitalist system, and therefore the various instruments of the superstructure were quite effective at creating a false consciousness in workers in order to stop people from voting for them. But even if they had got into power, we would have found that the banks decided to take money out of the country. We would have found that other capitalist employers would try and obstruct them, the policies that they tried to introduce. So they'll do that up to the point where they'll even become violent if they feel as though they're threatened. In which case, force is going to be necessary. But there's something beyond that as well, and it's to do with the workers themselves. Because for Marx and Engels, the idea of revolution is that it's workers' self-emancipation. It's not something to be just delivered to them by some nice middle-class people who happen to run the Labour Party. It's in the act of struggle, in the act of revolution, that the workers themselves will get rid of their alienation, get rid of their ideas about racism and sexism and other things that divide them, and identify their true class consciousness and their true class interest. And that's what Marx calls getting rid of the muck of ages, all the stuff that had been loaded on them by alienation, which had convinced them that that society was the one to carry on living in. That can only be got rid of if they're actually in the process of overthrowing the ruling class themselves and creating their new society. Oops. So there are 4 big ideas. What I'd done at the end of the session last time was to ask people to then think about, okay, well, how could we criticize Marx and Engels? So apart from each of those 4 big ideas, which I spent a little bit of time more talking about in the session, one of the things I asked you to do on your handout here, and I think it's on here, is to, oops, I'm going to do that there. No. Is to, I think this is on the classroom thing, is to take each one of these criticisms, there are 5 altogether, and then try and explain them in about a dozen words or so, and then try and think about, if those were criticisms, how might they be challenged? How might Marx and Engels be defended against those criticisms? And what you'll see on Classroom is a kind of little pro forma thing, a little ready-made sheet for you to kind of fill in the answers for that one. And we talked about that in the next session in lesson 6. Okay, that then is your summary of, I'll talk about those things next time. That is your summary of Marx and Engels. If you wanted more, then I could recommend these brilliant videos, which are really good at explaining some of the key terms that we've been thinking about before. So exploitation, revolution, communism, and alienation. If what I've said, you want more to be able to help you understand those words and add to your socialism dictionary that you've no doubt got in your files already, then this is a good place to start. Right, good, okay, that's lesson 5, Marx and Engels, key thinkers. Next time it'll be Rosa Luxemburg.